How did late medieval soldiers identify whose side they were on? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now recently I've actually been asked a few times under different videos about how did people identify whose side they were on during a late medieval battle. We're talking about the 100 Years' War, the Wars of the Roses, the various Burgundian Swiss wars, the wars going on in the Holy Roman Empire. So we're talking really here about the 15th century, maybe a little bit the later 14th and into the 16th as well. Now the reason people ask this is because if we look back at earlier periods, specifically looking at knights, they're usually wearing a form of what's commonly known as a surcoat, and very often they've got crests on the top of their helmets as well. Now most of you will realise that heraldic surcoats are a fantastic way of showing who you are, and this is how people would be identified, or at least knights would be identified on the battlefield. Now, knights came with retainers, so essentially the majority of the medieval army are made up of sets of people who are soldiers serving people above them. So it's a sort of feudalism, it started out as, and then what's known as bastard feudalism, and later on retinues and indentured soldiers. In some cases, like in terms of the Swiss, you've got a sort of confederacy, which is a different kind of structure. But in countries like England and France and most of the Holy Roman Empire, most of the soldiers are either going to be directly owing their loyalty, fealty and service to a lord, and they will wear their colours, or to a city or city-state or a militia, in which case they wear the colours of the city that they're serving, or the city-state, or the kind of overlord of that area. Or there'll be indentured soldiers. Now it's interesting, if we look at the 100 Years' War, we actually see there starts to be a tradition of English soldiers wearing a red cross and French soldiers wearing a white cross. The red cross for St. George, the white cross for Saint Denis. And so again, we've got this kind of like team colours idea. Now, when we come forward into the 100 Years' War, this, as I say, this could get very, very confusing if people just wore the colours of their lords, because in many cases you'd have a French, or let's say someone from Paris who had a bunch of his retinue there who maybe wore blue and white, and you might have an English knight who had his retinue there who also wore blue and white. So it could have got very, very confusing. So understandably they boiled this down into a system of trying to have a red cross and a white cross so you knew who was who. This is one sort of aspect of it. We'll come to another aspect in a minute, which is a little bit more difficult to explain. When we come forward to something like the Wars of the Roses, wearing of a lord's colours became particularly important, because much like in Game of Thrones, you often ended up with people being either on the Yorkist or the Lancastrian side and switching sides at various points. So you really needed to be familiar with the team colours and the heraldry. Now, not only did you have primary colours, so let's say that your lord who you serve or you're indentured to, so either you're levied or paid, his main colours, let's say, are red and yellow. So your livery colours, and this is an important word to remember, livery, your livery colours are probably going to be red and yellow. So first of all, your lord might be armigerous, in other words, he's got the right to wear a coat of arms, so he might wear an arming coat or a tabard with heraldry on it, and the primary colours might be red and yellow, so his indentured or kind of bodyguard troops or levied troops will also wear red and yellow, and they will have a flag which will show parts of his coat of arms. You'll also, for English lords, they'll have the St. George cross, because by the late 15th century this was also conventional as well, where you have a white flag with a red cross on it in addition to the coat of arms and the primary colours. So in other words, on the battlefield you'll look for the banner, you'll look for the other people who are wearing the same colours as you, and you'll look at the lord and maybe members of his family and close retainers who wear, in some cases, more elaborate coats of arms like his. But in addition to all of this, so you've got flags, you've got livery coats, you've also got badges. Now, there's also sashes as well. So sometimes you'll get badges which are associated with a particular member of the nobility. For example, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who later became Richard III of England, his emblem was the boar, or Edward IV, when he was Edward, Earl of March, his emblem was the sun in splendour, the flaming sun. So in some cases, again, much like in Game of Thrones, and this is where it comes from in Game of Thrones, the sigils, the emblems might be worn as a badge. Okay, so sometimes it will be a badge actually sewn onto the kind of livery jacket, sometimes it will be on a sash, this kind of thing. So that badge is an emblem, and sometimes it's separate from the coat of arms. So it might have nothing to do with the colour or the emblems of the coat of arms, it might just simply be a badge that's worn as well. So there's all of these sort of important symbols and colours which are used to identify people. But here's the other aspect which often doesn't get talked about that much. With all of these people wearing all of these badges and all of these colours, yes, it could get incredibly confusing in a melee, in a skirmish on the battlefield. But one thing we have to remember is the way that medieval battles were fought. So usually you only get, let's say, 2 or 3 battles, that is big units. So unlike later Renaissance and post-Renaissance warfare, where you might get lots of smaller units, usually in medieval warfare, if it's a big battle anyway, what you'll usually have is large blocks of soldiers. In some cases, as few as 2 or 3. So you'll get a battle in the front, a battle in the middle, and a battle at the rear, or you might get 1 at the front, 2 at the rear. And sometimes there might be a reserve. There might be some reserve cavalry hiding off in the woods, or there might be some archers out on the flanks. You might sometimes have smaller units who are separate to the main army. But in most cases, most of the army are going to be in very large formations. Now this inherently, whilst within that formation you might have all kinds of banners, all kinds of emblems, badges, sigils if you want to call them that, or indeed livery jackets in different colours, and you might find that you've got some red and yellow guys on this side, but there's some red and yellow guys on that side. But it doesn't matter that much, because for the most part in medieval battles, one side is clearly here, one side is clearly there. They come in, they clash, they move apart, they manoeuvre around, but they are large, cohesive masses. Okay, so I've tried to keep this fairly concise. I've covered a lot of things. Obviously, we could drill down into more detail on any one of these things. We could look at medieval banners, we could look at livery colours and livery coats, we could look at badges. There's all sorts of interesting aspects of this topic which we could break down into more detail, but that is a summary and an overview, and I hope answers the numerous questions I've had actually over the last few months about how did medieval soldiers identify each other on the battlefield. And one important thing to mention as well is that as we go into the late 15th century, if we look at knights or men-at-arms, often they are wearing all white harness, so they're not wearing an arming coat. And very often they would only be identified by an emblem on their helmet, for example, and a lot of them didn't even have that, or they might wear a badge, or they might just be recognised by the people who they're with and who they're standing around. So in many cases, individually, it'd be very difficult to identify a certain knight as being a specific person, but you would only know who he was because of who he was with, and you might possibly even recognise that person from their armour. And so that's another aspect we could look at in the future. Was it important to have armour that was identifiable without colours, without badges, without crests? Because as we go into the late 15th century, sometimes people are just in a harness of armour and don't have these emblems anymore. And certainly as we go into the 16th century, that becomes even more the case. Anyway, I hope this has been useful for those of you who've raised this topic. I think we probably will look at the subjects, because they're pretty interesting, of emblems and livery badges and livery coats and this kind of stuff, flags and banners and all that kind of stuff in the future. Thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton. I will be again next time. Any particular questions, obviously down in the comments, and I hope we'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.